Mexico has one of the highest, if not the highest, murder rates for journalists, right? And so it's an extremely dangerous place to do actual reporting on the ground in Mexico, right? And so that there's a sense of fear where we even know of Mexican, news stations and journalists reaching out to cartels and saying to them, hey, let us know what you want to report because we don't want to get targeted, right? So that creates a problem in a lot of this. And a lot of that is not only just the cartels, just Mexican corruption and corrupt government officials that will, kind of use the excuse of cartels to go after journalists who are doing legitimate work.
Mexican drug cartels may seem like a distant issue confined to the violence of Latin America, but their reach extends far beyond Mexico's borders. Today, they are transnational power players driving the global fentanyl crisis, laundering billions through legitimate businesses, corrupting governments, and even adopting military-grade tactics that rival insurgent groups. Their influence is felt in rising overdose deaths, disrupted supply chains, strained law enforcement budgets, and geopolitical tensions involving the United States, China, and beyond. In short, cartels are not just Mexico's problem, they are a global threat with consequences that touch us all. Today from New York, we're speaking with Stefano Ritondale. Stefano is a seasoned former US Army armor officer who transitioned into military intelligence, bringing a wealth of field and analytical experience to his work. He currently serves as the Chief Intelligence Officer at Artorius, a cutting-edge open-source intelligence firm. Artorius leverages artificial intelligence and expert analysts to transform publicly available data, such as social media, news outlets and blogs, into near real-time intelligence accessible by a subscription-based app. Artorius actively democratizes open-source intelligence, offering an app named SITREP available on both iOS and Android, which delivers tailored insights on geopolitics, conflict zones, security events, weather, and more. Just the facts, no political agenda. I'm a subscriber. It's a fantastic piece of kit. Stefano, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you so much, John, for having me. It's a huge honor, and I'm very excited to talk about something that I think gets somewhat misinterpreted in the media. And I'm glad how you laid out the growth and reach of cartels. So I'm very excited for this conversation.
No worries, Stefano. Let's start off. Stefano, which Mexican cartels dominate today, and how stable or unstable are their power relationships between them?
Yeah, so I think the key one, just to go straight to your question, that has the most not only probably power inside of Mexico, but specifically international reach, is the Jalisco New Generation cartel. That clearly is the cartel that is growing the most. And I think that's the one that probably a lot of people now have, common understanding or some, of a knowledge of hearing that name. And then the second one, I think we need to adjust our vocabulary now because a lot of people would associate it with being the second one being the Sinaloa cartel. And the difference now, or the problem with that statement, is that as a unified cartel, that term doesn't exist anymore. The Sinaloa cartel doesn't exist as a unitary faction. They are an active civil war, and for all intents and purposes, fundamentally split between two factions, which is one faction, which was the son of El Chapo, who's in US prison, called Los Chapitos, led by one of the sons called Ivan Archibaldo. And then the other one is called Los Mayito Flacos. Now, the Mayito Flacos, he took over after his father, Mayo Zambada, was captured in the US. And the civil war started because Los Chapitos basically betrayed Mayo Zambada and turned him into the US. And that's what fractured the Sinaloa cartel. And so when we're talking about the Sinaloa cartel, we can't analyze them or discuss them as a unitary group, but by two separate factions, Los Chapitos and the Mayito Flacos. Clearly, the second one that is gaining predominance inside of Mexico and probably has a lot of power and influence, not only in Mexico, but internationally as well, is the Mayito Flacos. They are actually causing a lot of issues, not only for Los Chapitos, but the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And historically, the Sinaloa cartel has a lot of international reach, and a lot of that infrastructure, although degraded, still exists even within this civil war. But the Jalisco New Generation cartel now has an alliance with Los Chapitos, and they're both fighting Mayito Flaco. That gives CJNG that more greater international reach. Those are the two main ones that I would highlight. Although for most cases, all the other cartels, like the Gulf Cartel, that is also split between different factions. The Northeast Cartel, even the Juarez Cartel, La Familia Michoacana, United Cartels. Although a lot of them are more localized, we do see sometimes reports of some of their activities in certain areas, probably the United States or others, but the two big ones will always be the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the fractured Sinaloa Cartel.
So you're painting a picture of not one of consolidation, shall we say. We're talking about a very fragmented Mexican drug trade. So is there, I mean, can you give us a bit of a historical backdrop in terms of, is this now the drug cartels in Mexico at their most fractured, or have they been more consolidated, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? What's your view on that?
That's a very interesting question. So, like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel started because it fractured from a previous cartel, right? And so a lot of like the Sinaloa Cartel came from the Guadalajara Cartel, right? I mean, the last time there was only one big Mexican cartel was really the Guadalajara Cartel, and then that fractured to various, and then you continue to see that. So, for example, the Gulf Cartel, they're fractured into kind of various factions, but the two main one being the Scorpion Group out of Matamoros, Tamaulipas, which borders Brownsville, Texas, and then the Metros, which is in Reynosa, Tamaulipas, which borders McAllen. And so it's kind of interesting because you can run into this conversation of we are seeing fracturing, and that's a common theme we've seen in the last 10, 15, 20 years. But there's something somewhat interesting happening in Mexico. And I think that kind of is almost in a way a pivotal moment if you're analyzing cartels from a historical perspective. And that's the CGNG Chapitos alliance, right? So as I alluded to earlier, the Mayito Flacos and the Chapitos, the two factions of the Sinaloa cartel, are actively fighting each other. Los Chapitos were clearly losing, right? They were losing the most. And more importantly, what we were seeing is not only were they losing territory around Sinaloa, but for you to understand cartels, it's not just the leadership, it's the key factions underneath it. And those are very prominent within cartel landscape. For example, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel has a faction called Los Jardineros because it's their leader, and that's called the gardener in English, right? So that's how these guys operate. The problem those Chapitos were running into was not only they were getting, kind of defeated or losing battles against the Mayito Flacos, key factions and leaders of Los Chapitos were switching sides. And so it became pretty obvious that Los Chapitos were running into trouble. And oh, by the way, when the Civil War happened, the Mexican federal government clearly had a preference on one of the two sides to win the Civil War. So they were targeting Los Chapitos much more so than the Mayito Flacos. So Los Chapitos, seeing that they were in trouble, went to their historic, not only rivals of Los Chapitos, but specifically the Mayito Flacos, which was CGNG. And they entered into this alliance. And right now, we can call the CJNG Chapito an alliance, but there is conversations or kind of people are trying to hypothesize or say how this might run into a situation where the Jalisco New Generation Cartel might absorb Los Chapitos, right? So right now it's an alliance, but clearly Jalisco New Generation is the top dog, and they might absorb Los Chapitos. And so now what we're seeing is there's actual conversations and one of the things for your listeners who don't know, when you track cartels, a lot of it is rumor. You just, you got to look at the social media messaging groups. You got to talk to people on the ground. And that's kind of how I do. And, from my account, All Source News on X, TikTok, YouTube, etc. I have sources that I talk to. So you kind of have to, a lot of it is actual reporting. Some of them is just rumors and conversations and what people heard. And one of the conversations going on right now is, does Mayito Flaco counter that alliance with his own alliances, right? One of the main ones being the Northeast Cartel. Out of Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, which borders Laredo, Texas. And that's actually something that we've also seen historically in Mexico, where here comes either specifically Michoacan, a new player comes into town, a big cartel comes into town, a lot of the local cartels will form an alliance to fight this up and coming. And right now in Michoacan, that's the United Cartels, which has also been designated as a foreign terrorist organization. They're an alliance and conglomeration, or maybe even a confederation of various different cartels that formed an alliance to fight the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Now, what we're trying to analyze and see is because the Chapitos CJNG alliance kind of transforms the dynamics in Mexican cartel landscapes, does Maito Flaco respond with his own? And almost, do we see this almost like, we haven't seen it yet, but it's kind of the speculations that I've had conversation with, is like, do we start seeing these two, at least major blocks kind of battling each other out because this cartel landscape, this alliance really transformed a lot. And that's something that we can't necessarily discount, where Jalisco New Generation gets alliances because there's, the Juarez Cartel La Línea has a deep-seated alliance with CJNG. So do they kind of also be part of that bigger Chapito CJNG alliance? And do we see Maito Flaco do something else? And one more point, though. One of the things you have to be very kind of cognizant when you're analyzing all the cartels, because there's dozens of them, right? That a lot of times cartels operate via fronts. And here's a key example. There's a cartel down in Chiapas, which is the Mexican state that borders Guatemala, called the Cartel de Chiapas y Guatemala, or the Chiapas and Guatemala cartel. That's a CGNG front. That is CGNG, right? No question about it. And in Tamaulipas, as I mentioned, the Gulf Cartel, there was two, the Grupo Escorpión, or the Scorpion Group, and Metros. We knew the Metros had an alliance with CGNG. What was interesting, one of the recent sanctions lists from the Treasury Department, the U.S. Treasury Department against Mexican cartels, they targeted the leader of the Metros. And in the sanctions, they said is, this guy doesn't have an alliance with CJNG. In other words, he's not a leader of a Gulf Cartel faction that has an alliance with CJNG. He is the leader of CJNG in Tamaulipas, basically saying that the Metros being a faction of the Gulf Cartel, that's a front, that's a lie. They are CJNG. And that's kind of one of the interesting aspects of CJNG. What we're seeing is almost like this ability to form alliances, almost franchise and absorb groups into their command structure. And so you run into a situation where some cartels might be fracturing, some of them might be growing, but at the same time, CJNG has fractures as well, right? And so, that's a very long-winded answer to say it's much more convoluted and complex than that. But the Chapito CJNG alliance does have that opportunity to kind of transform, and maybe not consolidation, but alliances might be the future, at least in the next couple of months or years.
Stefano, you've painted a very complex picture. I'm just wondering, as an intelligence analyst and dealing with transnational criminal organizations, how good are these organizations at maintaining information discipline? How accurate is the information that you're getting? And is there misinformation fed into the system to deliberately deceive, the errant intelligence analyst out there? Because it seems to me that, as you said earlier, there's a lot of rumors, there's a lot of on-the-ground information, but people can say whatever they like, and I suppose the proof in the pudding is always in the eating. So you'll know what you know once you see what happens on the ground, as opposed to what is being told to you. Can you unpack for us that more complex information space that you're working with and your colleagues are working with? Yeah.
John, that's a phenomenal question, by the way. Love that question because you hit at the heart of the matter, which is true. Yes, there is misinformation. Now, I would say from an operational security or OPSAC, I think people have a misunderstanding of how cartels operate. They're very open. Now, granted, the leadership might be, more OPSEC savvy, if it's a term, but we're not talking about Osama bin Laden level. Let me make this clear, right? That's not anywhere remotely, to that point. Cartels are very open on social media and their members, and they don't necessarily hide because they have this sense of impunity, and they're right. They do have a sense of impunity, right? Because Mexico as a state doesn't have the monopoly of violence, and the judiciary highly corruptible and ineffective, and the prosecutors highly ineffective. 90% of violent crimes in Mexico don't even get investigated, right? And so that creates a very interesting dynamic where you do run into a situation where cartels are very open on social media, and they're not like an ISIS level or an Al Qaeda or other terrorist organizations around the world where that OPSEC is very key to them. That generally is not necessarily the case. Again, the higher you go up the command infrastructure, obviously, the more cognizant they are. The misinformation piece is a very interesting point because, yes, that does happen. However, what I would say is generally where the misinformation would occur is actually not where you think. It's more because it comes more from established Mexican media sources. And it's not the journalists. I'm not trying to criticize their work. Let me make this clear in that aspect, but it is attempts. There's two aspects to this, right? One, Mexico has one of the highest, if not the highest, murder rates for journalists, right? And so it's an extremely dangerous place to do actual reporting on the ground in Mexico, right? And so that there's a sense of fear where we even know of Mexican, news stations and journalists reaching out to cartels and saying to them, hey, let us know what you want to report because we don't want to get targeted, right? So that creates a problem in a lot of this. And a lot of that is not only just the cartels, just Mexican corruption and corrupt government officials that will, kind of use the excuse of cartels to go after journalists who are doing legitimate work, right? So that's number one. But number two, we also know of cases where Mexican cartels pay news organizations to push stories more favorable to them, right? And so that's generally when you see a lot of the misinformation happen is, from there. And the problem you run into is that a lot of times, and again, sometimes it's, a lot of times it's not necessarily the journalists, it's others, but you do see also cartel members reach out to news organizations, not only in Mexico, but in the United States or other key people to push a narrative. And the problem that you have to debate yourself, right? Because I've even run into this issue, right, when you're doing reporting is, okay, maybe I can't necessarily always validate his information, but it's still newsworthy. And those some of the things that people in the press run into is saying this might be false, but the overarching arc of the story is important. And even that narrative needs to get light, regardless if it's true or not. And I think that's kind of the issue that you also run into because we do know I've had conversations with people and I said, for Mexican cartels, the truth doesn't matter. What matters is perception. Perception is the key. 100%. They don't care about the truth, they care about perception. And that's what they will do the most to influence people is to have this perception, for example, of strength or whatever it may be. And they will go above and beyond to do that and ensure that the perception is, might not be true, but that's what people believes is reality. And so that's an issue you run into. So again, when you're talking about in a misinformation space, it really goes down to it's the aggregation of information. That's how we, not only myself, but our company, Artorius, and when we're doing this, it's not one story, for example, right? It's the aggregation of a lot that then generally gives you trends and analysis that you can go. And here's a perfect example. During the Mayito Flaco Chapito Civil War, both sides at the beginning on their social media pages, on their propaganda pages, were going at each other, right? Back and forth. Or, Chapito's guys would post on social media were very strong. Mayito Flacos would do the same. Before the CJNG Chapito alliance, when it really looked like those Chapitos were in trouble, one of the ways you can notice that they were in trouble is because a lot of their social media not necessarily became quiet, but they were very quiet, right? They were not active on social media. They weren't posting as much. Their messaging groups were very, very quiet. And so, again, it's not just one report, it's the aggregation. And you're saying, okay, well, one side, the Mayito Flacos, are very prevalent, very loud, and the other side is very quiet. That aggregation of information then does kind of confirm, okay, something is going on with Los Chapitos, something is problematic. And when did we see the Chapitos getting back more active was when they announced their alliance with CJNG officially with a very famous video that actually had a source of mine give me a heads up a couple hours before it was uploaded on social media. Hey, the video of those Chapitos CJNG alliance that has been rumored for months, it's coming out, it's now official. And effectively, then it came out. And then you saw Los Chapitos be much more active. So again, sometimes it's not the independent story in and of itself, but then you have to zoom out and analyze it from 30,000 feet to get a better picture. So you might miss the tree, but at least you're seeing the forest, which sometimes is very hard to do when tracking cartels.
Yeah, that is a complex piece of work you're involved with, but thanks for the explanation. I'm sure the listeners would really appreciate it. Now, Stefano, there's another thing that I need to ask you, and that is, you mentioned earlier that Mexico doesn't have a monopoly on violence. And that is true because all the drug cartels seem to be very up-armed and quite able to enforce their will. So, in your assessment, what are the Mexicans doing in terms of trying to get on top of things? I mean, is it a case of divide and rule rather than attack and hold? Do they play one cartel off against the other in order to try to destroy as much capacity as possible, using the cartels, the ones that they're sort of orientated toward, as their proxies? How does that war in Mexico happen?
So I'm going to answer your question, but I think but let me give this kind of a little analytical a twist to that. And I think
Yeah.
what I've said was Mexico is not suffering a cartel war. What Mexico is suffering is various cartel wars that, in many instances, aren't directly linked one from another. And so, to answer that question, it's not, people want to say, oh, Mexico as a whole. In reality, you would have to basically go by region because the conflict and the violence, let's say, affecting Tabasco down in southeast or Mideast Mexico has nothing to do with the violence in Sonora, which borders Arizona. Those are two completely separate conflicts. And that's the problem from the Mexican government perspective. And oh, by the way, it's not just the Mexican federal government, it's what do the local governments do, what do the state governments do, and what do the federal governments do. And a lot of times those three objectives don't overlap or don't match each other. Because everything you laid out, all the different examples, I can pinpoint to different states. In one state, they're doing this. In one state, they're doing that. In one state, they're doing another thing. So, for example, in Michoacan and in Sinaloa, for example, at least historically or even recently, it was pretty clear that the Mexican federal government picked a side, right? So in Michoacan, generally they favor more los carteles unidos than they do against the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and those, the Mexican military target more CJNG. But it's also a situation where it could be because the guys on the ground, the bases there, are they get more influenced by the Carteles Unidos. And so if the Mexican federal government wants to do something against Carteles Unidos, they have to send in another unit to go after them, right? And Sinaloa, during the beginning of this, so it was very clear that the Mexican federal government was targeting los chapitos way more than los mayitos flacos, right? And so again, here's in some instances, yes, they just go after a cartel to try to get rid of it. And the perfect example of that would be historically the Zetas cartel. Clearly, the Mexican government just had enough, and they just went fully against the Zetas cartel. The same happened with the Arellano Felix organization or the Tijuana cartel, where they went after them. Other instances, they pick a side. They pick one group more so than the other, and they target that group they want more. And for example, in Sinaloa, the irony of the situation was the Mexican federal government, although they were attacking los chapitos more, the Sinaloa state government had a long history of collaborating with los chapitos. And so it wasn't a situation where you had state and federal police battling each other out, but clearly the federal government and some of those military personnel maybe couldn't trust Los Chapitos, the state government, because of their historical connections, right? And in other situations, we've actually seen the Mexican federal government just act as peacekeepers. So in Tamaulipas, with the Gulf Cartel Civil War, when you had the Scorpion Group and the Metros battling it out, those two factions reached a ceasefire agreement. And a lot of that was because of political pressure from the Mexican federal government, and the state government was saying this violence is getting out of hand. And IEDs were everywhere, drones were being used, the violence was excessive. And it looked like, and there was also a little bit of concern because this was shortly after Trump was inaugurated president again for his second term. There was concern about violence being so active right there at the border. So the Metros and the Scorpion Group entered into a ceasefire. And then what we actually saw was that Tamaulipas state government, even the military, deployed forces to basically be peacekeepers. And there was a very famous picture that the government released shortly after announcing this huge deployment of forces that coincided with the ceasefire agreement. And when we geolocated that picture, it was literally like more or less on the front line. And I use that term a little bit loosely in cartels. I don't want people to think it's like Russia, Ukraine, where there's a definitive front line. Again, in Mexico, there's a lot of gray area, but there are general territorial control. The Tamaulipas state police and the federal government was there acting as peacekeepers to ensure that both sides honored that agreement. And so again, you run into a situation where It just depends which state we're talking about, which conflict we're talking about, which organizations, which cartels corrupt which levels of the government structure, the federal, state, or local. And also at the same time, I think it's also important for people to understand that from the Mexican government perspective, their priority is safety and reducing violence. So if you, regardless of the corruption aspect, which is completely prevalent, at sometimes the government has a vested interest in ensuring we don't want to rock the situation. We don't want to detain this cartel leader because of the concern that violence might go up. And for example, Durango, this one of the safest states in Mexico, but there's one cartel that controls it, which is Los Cabreras under the Mayito Flacos. But they have absolute control, and the Durango State Police, for the most part, don't interfere with this group. And then again, yes, there's a corruption aspect, but it's also from a perspective saying we just don't want violence to get out of hand. We don't want to end up like Sinaloa. And that's a decision that they have to make. And I think that's when you're analyzing Mexican decision making, analyze it from a perspective of trying to reduce violence. And sometimes it's not in their interest necessarily to go after a cartel because they don't want to cause violence to go up.
You're giving me so much information. My head is spinning right now, Stefano. But let's go on to some other key issue here, and that is how do generational shifts in cartel leadership, like sons replacing fathers, affect cartel cohesion and brutality?
That again, phenomenal question. It's very interesting you say that because generally we've seen that mostly, actually, we've seen that a lot in the Sinaloa cartel. So when a Chapo was captured, Mayo Zambada, which was still my opinion, he was more powerful than El Chapo in my opinion, but clearly El Chapo was the face of it, right, and very predominant figure within the Sinaloa cartel, the Sinaloa cartel leadership. Los Chapitos kind of took a lot of the business reins in Sinaloa. And it's interesting because it's almost as if the situation with Los Chapitos had to kind of make a name for themselves because they didn't have the name recognition back then as El Chapo. Ivan Archibaldo specifically, which is kind of ironic because Ivan Archibaldo, way back historically, wasn't viewed as this very charismatic leader. And now he's the undisputed charismatic leader of Los Chapitos, right? And so Los Chapitos are four brothers: Ivan Archibaldo, Jesus Alfredo, Ovidio Guzman, and then Joaquin Guzman, who has the same name as the father. Ovidio Guzman and Joaquin Guzman are in U.S. prison. Ovidio Guzman was captured by the Mexicans and extradited. Joaquin Guzman was the one who betrayed Mayo Zambada and turned him. He was basically working for the FBI and turned him into the U.S., tricked Mayo Zambada and flew him into a plane that instead of was going somewhere in Mexico, flew to El Paso, and there were federal authorities detaining him. So then you have Ivan Archibaldo and Jesus Alfredo. Ivan Archibaldo, from where historically was in the past to now, he clearly made a name for himself to the point that if he falls, Jesus Alfredo, though, he is nobody. If Ivan Archibaldo gets captured, the structure of Los Chapitos is dead. They would have to completely, I think, revamp or have to pull somebody completely outside of the structure of the family to take over because Jesus Alfredo will never be that figure. Like very, very, very likely will never get to that point. And so what you saw in the Sons of Los Chapitos was the same kind of. They tried to be first, kind of, assert the power. They had armed groups under them. Ovidio Guzman had an armed group called Los Ratones because his nickname was El Raton, the rat. So they would have the gunmen. And so that was a way of showing their power and strength, right, from that kind of militarized aspect. But at the same time, it was kind of this business-esque type of operation. So like almost in a very weird comparison, if I may, almost kind of like the Silicon Valley in the cartel landscape, of the sense of we're the new guys in town, but we want to make a name for ourselves, both in terms of strength from a military and a militant perspective, but also from a business perspective. And Ivan Archibaldo is probably one of the main reasons why was one of the main groups responsible for the fentanyl push into the United States, probably more than anybody else. So you had that comparison. If you look at Mayo Zambada, when his son took over Mayito Flaco, I don't think people really assumed Mayito Flaco was going to be Mayo Zambada's successor. But I think within the structure of Mayo Zambada's and all the factions and the cartels underneath him, they quickly realized either we coalesce around somebody or we're going to lose everything. And so they decided to coalesce around Mayito Flaco. And what I would say is Manito Flaco is basically the cowboy. Just this guy who has no problems launching offensives in various areas against various of his rivals. And if anything, it's almost somewhat working, right? In Zacatecas, he's doing better. And Sinaloa, he's doing better. Like they are gaining ground. And I think that's Mayo Zambada. He is this, I mean, Mayito Flaco, this young upcoming leader who's trying to consolidate himself and maybe a kind of, again, loose comparison would be kind of when Kim Jong-un kind of rose into power after the death of his father, right? The way he consolidated power through violence, I guess, internally in North, not, internally in North Korea. Mayo Zambada did that more externally against his rivals to say, I think also is a way to say, I can prove myself that we can gain more territory, we can be powerful, and this is how we're doing it. And oh, more importantly, my father was betrayed by Los Chapitos. I need to avenge him so people don't, take me lightly. And I think that message has been sent across very well. You do run into situations, for example, the CDN cartel, that is a family business, Los Trevino family, right? They have a long history. So when one is captured, it's somebody within the Trevino family structure kind of takes over. And so that's a very common aspect. But I think the main difference of that, though, would be the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Because El Mencho, not much is known about him publicly, but his family, although they're active in the cartel, they're not key leaders of the cartels. Like they're involved maybe in the logistical aspects, the money laundering here and there. But El Mencho's brothers, I think at least two of them have been captured already, and with not much craziness from the Jalisco New Generation. That's an interesting dynamic because if El Mencho falls, kind of who's next? And I think there's a key leader named Alfredo Tres. I think generally everybody, his right-hand man, would take over. But at that point, it's not a family business. And we don't really know anything about El Mencho's children's family much. He's very obscure. And so some cartels do follow the family business model, others don't. And we'll see with CJNG, we would just have to wait and see what happens to Mencho if he dies or gets captured or something. What happens, because right now everybody's looking at Fero Tres, but the other problem that CJNG has is there's a lot of powerful lieutenants. They have very powerful lieutenants. Maybe they decide, no, I don't want to take orders from this guy. I want to be in charge, or maybe I want to break off and form my own. And that's kind of what everybody kind of is looking for, and trying to analyze that situation.
Okay, Stefano, let's tilt from Mexico to the international reach these cartels actually have. So, how central are Mexican cartels to global organized crime compared to groups like the Italian mafia, Russian syndicates, or Chinese triads?
I would easily make the statement that Mexican cartels are the most predominant international drug trafficking organization in the world. Like they have the most international reach. And I think it's almost to the point where I'm almost to the point it's undisputable, much more so than the Russians and the Chinese. Yeah, and I think, look, maybe when you're analyzing the Russian organized crime, you have to analyze it also from the Russian security services. The same with the Chinese, that they might leverage these organized crime groups, so that gives them more influence because they can be kind of a unofficial or even sometimes official extension of the state. So, in that context, but the Mexican cartels, obviously, they just operate independently. But I think the last estimate we got from the DEA was that CGNG was prevalent in over 40 countries around the world. And we're not talking about like your Europe only, like South America, Africa, India has detained CGNG members in India, Indian law enforcement, because they were building drug labs in India, right? That's a fundamental difference. And the Sinaloa Cartel, I believe, was over 20 countries that they knew they had reporting from there. The other cartels obviously are smaller. CDN, I do know of a one case, for example, they were in Spain. But when you're looking at the Jalisco New Generation cartel, I think that's the cartel with the most international reach, undisputably. And there's even a problem where sometimes violence from Mexico might get exported to other countries. And that's kind of Ecuador. Now, Ecuador, with the gang violence that they have, Los Lobos, etc., obviously they had a lot of their own internal violence, and there was a lot of internal domestic issues in Ecuador. But it's also true to say that the Sinaloa Cartel and CJNG cartel war in Mexico got exported to Ecuador. And they all picked different rival groups that started battling each other out in Ecuador, and they just wanted the piece of play in the pie. Now, the irony, for example, in Colombia, there's actually reporting where CJNG and Sinaloa said in Colombia, hey, let's not fight each other here in Colombia because this is where we get our cocaine. We can fight in Mexico, but let's not fight here because we need the cocaine. So again, it goes back to specific country aspects of analyzing it. But the international reach and the violence in Ecuador, you can tie it back in at least some percentage of the fault to the cartel, violence in Mexico over to Ecuador. But to answer your question, yes, and you're based out of Australia. We've seen reports of narco submarines from South America get sent over to Australia. Now, a lot of that could be drug trafficking organizations in Latin America, specifically, not necessarily tied to a cartel. But at the same time, Mexican cartels have a lot of that infrastructure necessary to reach around the world. And in Australia, there are Mexican cartels. But, in Africa, I think in Kenya, if I'm not mistaken, they detain CJNG members in Kenya related to drug trafficking. West Africa, the drug trafficking routes from South America through West Africa up to Europe, we do know Mexican cartels are very active there in West Africa. I think that's a fundamental reach that even other organized crime groups don't necessarily have, even with the support, officially and unofficially, with their nation state actors.
I have to ask you a question from an Australian perspective. Of course, we're very concerned with the security of the microstates of the South Pacific, and I'm wondering when we're talking about, supply routes and the influence these cartels have. I mean, how central are the routes from Mexico throughout the Pacific, inclusive of the island states of the Pacific, in order to, make their webs to places like Australia, New Zealand, and further afield to India, for instance?
That's a very interesting question. I do know recently, I believe it was a couple of weeks ago, one of the French islands, I can't, right now it slips my mind which one, in the Pacific, one of the micro colonies out there, they seized a massive amount of drug seizures from a maritime drug trafficking route that they believe came from somewhere in Latin America when it was first reported. Yeah, that does play a role as well. Again, the Mexican cartels, and I think when you're analyzing Mexican cartels, you have to analyze them from a Mexican perspective, how they operate inside of Mexico, and then they operate differently internationally, or like in the U.S. They're not in Mexico. They might be battling each other out, and generally, if you ask, what is the average cartel member in Mexico, you would think of the gunman, the sicario, and all that, right? But if you look at other places around the world, like the United States, Australia, those microstates, look more a guy who's more of a businessman, a lawyer, somebody more involved in export and import, right? It's more of a business mindset in how they would operate as a corporation. And that's kind of the general average image. Yes, you still have your gunmen here and operating in the US or anywhere, right? Your typical cigar, but that's not the prevalent image. It's more of the people, because again, these are multi-billion-dollar companies if they were legal. I mean, and their logistical capability rivaled that of most corporations around the world. So they need the business infrastructure to support that. And that's kind of how they do that. And so yes, they would leverage those microstates, specifically if they need to do drug shipment into Australia, which we do know happens and gets reached into from South America. Now, again, we don't know if every single, it's kind of hard because sometimes when Australians would, let's say, seize a maritime vessel doing drug trafficking or narco submarine, sometimes it's hard to know exactly who's the pusher because, again, a lot of times the cartels, how they operate is they might sell it to a local mafia group or crime syndicate or gang in the country. And so how to imagine them is, the cartels might be like your Maersk, right? What does Maersk do? They just transport it. They don't own anything. They're just the wholesale sender of the product. So they just own the product from Mexico or South America, or even the South American drug trafficking organization. It doesn't necessarily have to be cartels. They get into a deal with an Australian crime syndicate or mafia or gang, and they say, okay, well, we're sending it here. Well, and it's used. And we're just like here. Or maybe even that own crime syndicate say, hey, I have my own methods of doing it. I want to do it my way. And they're like, okay, then here's the product, pick it up in this port, and then you guys send it over. And that's the business aspect of it, right? And so that's how these cartels are. They're more of an international drug trafficking. They're not the ones that are going to give it to you on the streets. They're the ones that are going to give you the bulk quantity to your local crime syndicates and then push it. And one of the comparisons I make about Mexican cartels is when you're generally trying to analyze them, I always say, think of Amazon, because Mexican cartels are profit markets, right? Think of Amazon mixed with Blackwater.
Wow.
That's
Okay.
what a cartel is. They're profit motive organizations that just have a very powerful armed wing as well. And it's Amazon and Blackwater. And then in an Australia perspective, I would in many ways compare them to like your Maersk. They just push the product, but they're not the ones that are going to do all the dealings inside of Australia.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from New York, we're speaking with Chief Intelligence Officer at Artorius, Stefano Ritondale. Stefano, to what extent do cartels shape or corrupt Mexican politics, both locally and nationally?
So very much so, and there's two ways to analyze the corruption problem in Mexico. So you highlighted a situation where let me put it this way: the cartels, let's say, are the bottom up to the government official, right?
Yeah.
And yes, that does happen. That Mexico managed to find either in the local, state, or federal government, either elected political officials or more kind of like your administrative state or your military security forces. We know, for example, the Mexican customs was highly corruptible by organized crime and cartels in Mexico across the board. So yes, that does happen. And if we can analyze this from a local, like an election perspective, we've actually had a situation where there was credible accusations, proof where one political candidate was being paid by a cartel, and during an election, the political rival was being supported by a rival one. And sometimes that kind of also kind of ties into the violence, right? And those cartels are powering, corrupting the government official. But I think it's important also to highlight that it also happens the other way around, where it's not necessarily the cartel that is corrupting the government official. It's that the government official is already corrupt. But the difference is he has the power to tell the cartel member, you're going to do this, or I'm just going to send the military or the police after you. So your choice, right? So it's the government official might say, I want you to give me a slice of whatever profit you're making. You want to use this road? Every time you cross this road, you got to pay me X percentage. You know what? That journalist, he's digging too much in my finance. Send somebody to execute or kill him. I want to make sure my political rival doesn't have a chance of winning. So do X, Y, and Z. Oh, and if you don't do exactly as I say, here's the military. And this reached the highest level of the Mexican federal government. We know a specific case of a Mexican army general called General Cienfuegos. So for our listeners to understand, like in Australia and the United States, if you look at the military, how it works is the president appoints a civilian secretary of defense or minister of defense, and it's a civilian. And then underneath him, he'll have like his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and that's the Army, the Navy, et cetera, right? And that's how they operate. In Mexico, that's not how the military operates. There's no civilian leadership, and there's no joint command. You have the Army and the Navy. Both of them are cabinet level positions, but they're led by a general and an admiral, right? The senior, most highest ranking Army general officer, this was in the mid 2010s. I believe he was in charge from like 2000, don't quote me on this, 10 to 14 or 50, something along those lines. When he was the head of the Army, he was being paid by used to be a faction of the Sinaloa Cartel until then. In 2008, they both broke off and was engaged in very violence. As called BLO. General Cienfuegos, for one reason or another, there's a great New York Times article that lays out this story. One day basically said, you know what, I'm done. I'm done with this guy. He sent in the special forces to kill him. And in the New York Times report, what they laid out is this cartel leader, when the special forces came in, he had his hand raised up and he said, I'm Cienfuegos' guy. I'm Cienfuegos' guy. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? I'm his guy. And then he was executed on the spot. And we know this New York Times reporting, the reason why we know this is because he was indicted in the United States. One day he traveled into Los Angeles. The DOJ quickly unsealed the indictment and detained him during the first Trump administration. That caused a political and diplomatic crisis of relations between the US and Mexico, where the US agreed to give it back. This was during the previous Mexican president, AMLO, Andres Manuel López Obrador. When he was in jail in LA, the Trump administration folded and gave Cienfuegos to the Mexicans, and the Mexicans did nothing to him. But when you read the story and what I told you, my question to you, John, is who do you think had the power of the who was more like who had the power? Was it the cartel? Because that's what you generally think when the cartels corrupt somebody. If the government official doesn't do what the cartel does, they just kill him, which again happens. But in the story I just laid out, my question to you, John, who do you think actually had the control? The BLO guy who was executed, or the chief army officer who had the power of sending the special forces to execute them? And
Chief Army Officer.
that's a problem. We
Right.
see this too, where a lot of times and a lot of times it's just the government officials are the ones who corrupt, and we know of ample evidence of inside of Mexico across the military, law enforcement, etc., where they're involved in criminal activities and corrupt activities. So it wouldn't be fair to just lay all the blame in the cartels. It's a both end strength, and you have to analyze it from both. Again, complex.
Okay, so since the beginning of this year, with the new Trump administration, Trump 47, there's been a great focus, a redoubling, of doubling down, I should say, on the U.S.-Mexican border security crisis. Is this crisis actually driven by cartel operations rather than migration alone? What's the push-pull factor here?
So if you're talking about, what I would say is if you're analyzing the specifically from the migrant crisis, right? It's actually interesting is that not all cartels are actually like involved in human smuggling. You have some that are much more prevalently active in it. For example, the Northeast Cartel, La Línea, or the Juarez Cartel. Those, and even some of the factions of the Gulf cartels, like the Scorpion Group or Metros. Some of them do have involvement, greater or smaller. And I would say, for example, CDN, the Northeast Cartel, is much more involved in the human smuggling aspect. But for the most part, most cartels aren't involved in it, in the sense that they're not the ones that are the ones pushing the migrants into the U.S. What they have is they have the territorial control in the plazas, and so what you see is human smuggling networks that operate both in Mexico and in the United States that basically pay a fee to the cartel to be able to operate in their plaza. And it's these human smuggling networks that are the ones that are doing all the pushing of migrants into the United States from this human smuggling aspect, right? That's and so a lot of times you hear, oh, the cartels are the ones pushing the migrants. Like, not necessarily. Yes, some are much more active than others, but for the most part, and some of them fight for territory, like in Sonora. A lot of the violence in Sonora can kind of be traced back to the human smuggling routes, but it's not necessarily to control the migrant per se. It's just to control the routes, so that way the human smuggling networks or the alien smuggling organizations, the ASOs, have to pay the fee to be able to operate there. And there's dozens, if not hundreds, of these human smuggling networks, not only in Mexico but in the United States. They're very much involved in pushing these people around, and it's not necessarily the cartel. Again, some instances, yes, but not 100% all the time. And I think that gets mixed up. And that the narrative kind of misses the point, where people put blame where that's not necessarily there. Because in Juarez, for example, Ciudad Juarez, the violence in Ciudad Juarez that we see is mostly between local gangs, because there's the main cartel that controls Ciudad Juarez is the Juarez cartel. You do have a smaller Sinaloa cartel presence as well there, but they're not major they're not really. The violence in Ciudad Juarez is not between those two. What actually is happening is the violence is between the local gangs and even sometimes the local human smuggling networks, who battle each other for control of those routes and for control of the migrants to then be able to push them into the United States. And you can kind of see the Juarez cartel in a lucid way saying, look, you guys figure it out. Just pay me what I'm owed. Like, I don't. I don't care. Or they might pick one and say, oh, you know what, this guy's becoming a nuisance. And so it's not necessarily true to always put the blame on from the human smuggling network of migration, right, on solely the cartels, when a lot of times it's just criminal networks, both in Mexico and the US, that are much more involved in that push aspect into the US.
Stefano, I've got to ask you the obvious question. Trump has made a big deal about the wall. We need to build a wall. But in the public imagination, a wall is an impervious object. You're giving us an idea that there is nothing that will keep the tide of Mexican cartels out of the United States, wall or no wall. So is Trump really understanding the nature of the threat that he's facing? I mean, it's a far more sophisticated threat than a wall would simply get rid of, right?
Well, yeah, the wall, the tunnels. It's
Right.
actually funny because one of the things, again, what I would say is let me actually address this point quickly. I think a lot of times what people don't realize in the United States is how our migration folk almost sometimes like obsession is actually detrimental to our overall, not only our own interests sometimes, because the policies are trying to address the migration, is sometimes it makes either the situation worse for us, but specifically worse for the countries where it's coming from, right?
Right.
So, for example, in Guatemala, during the first Trump administration, they allowed the Guatemalan government, who was highly corrupt, to gut the international tribunal responsible for actually holding government, corruption accountable. The Guatemalan government came in, gutted them, and the Trump administration said, "We don't care, just control the migrants." And the problem was that the reason why there were people fleeing Guatemala was because of the government. It was the government
Yeah.
was the main culprit of it. And we enabled them to gut the only body really holding them accountable because of our singular focus and attention on the migration. Another example is when we tell the Mexican government, and this is where we don't necessarily analyze it properly, we tell the Mexican government, you need to deploy people to the border to secure, secure either the US Mexico border, or you need to control the border with Guatemala to prevent migrants coming through. Okay, fine, granted. Here's the problem. If you're having military and National Guard personnel from the Mexican side control the border, guess what they're not controlling? The territories where these cartels operate, specifically in urban or rural areas, specifically rural areas. So what do the cartels do? They just expand their influence specifically in rural areas, and then they become the predominant power. And then when violence happens between rivals cartels, and there's not a Mexican military unit to be able to respond to it or to try to pacify the region, then we see migrants coming into the US. That's what happened in Chiapas. I would tell reporters, specifically in kind of conservative media, because I talked to them regularly, I was like, look at the violence in Chiapas. In 2 weeks, they're going to be in the US-Mexico border. When violence was really bad in Chiapas, and we did see a significant push into Chiapas. In Sonora, there's a Sasabe, Arizona, Sasabe, Sonora. The violence got so bad in Sasabe, Sonora, that they just all crossed over to the United States. And then another aspect of this is that, the predatory natures of sometimes how these cartels operate. And what they do is the one perfect example, I think I told you, yes, I did mention this early in the podcast, which was the Gulf Cartel, that civil war, they have a ceasefire. One of the stipulations of the ceasefires was this term called basically, like respecting migrants. What that meant is that if a migrant crossed into the United States and then was deported so let's say they in Tamaulipas specifically, they would cross over Reynosa, that's the Metro's territory.
Yeah.
US authorities would get them, Title 42, immediately deportation. But then instead of deporting them back through Reynosa, from McAllen back to Reynosa, they would get deported to Matamoros, which is the rivals. So the rival cartel would see that this migrant, hey, you paid my rival to cross into the United States. So you have two options. You either pay me more, and if you don't, I execute you, or I forcibly recruit you and you work for me. And that would happen. And I would tell, like, and so the term respect for migrants then became, that practice ended. In other words, if they were then deported to the rivals would be, okay, no, this is your migrant, or your human smuggling operations was based on my rival's territory, we're just going to hand you over to them. Because for these human smugglers and a lot of these cartel members, deportations is not a bad thing because they could just charge you again to try to cross. It's not like drugs that once they get captured, it gets lost completely. Deportations in many ways, oh, we could just try again, right? And I think that was specifically the deportation in Tamaulipas specifically. That's why a lot of migrants tried to avoid trying to cross over the United States through Tamaulipas. And I know this personally because in 2018, I was deployed to the border when I was in active duty. When Trump first ordered the active duty military there, I was in San Diego, and we were sent to San Diego because of the caravan, the first caravan, and the everything we were getting told by law enforcement was there's two routes they can take. They can either take the fastest route, which is through the Gulf of Mexico, or now I guess Gulf of America, depending where your part of the world is, or through all the long route through the west all the way up to Tijuana and then San Diego. And the assessment was they're going to take the long route because Tamaulipas is too violent and too dangerous for them and they don't want to risk it. And that's effectively what happens. And so, again, sometimes our myopic focus on migration and being so hyper-focused about it, we don't take the time to analyze and say, wait, are these policies actually making the situation better or worse? Not only for us, but even our overall national security objective of, let's say, if we want to eliminate a cartel. Because if you're deporting mass amount of people to the rival's territory, now they just have a large hold of people that they can extort or forcibly recruit.
Okay. Let's look ahead, shall we? What scenarios worry you the most about cartel evolution? Could they one day rival terrorist organizations in global impact, or are they already there?
Oof. Oof. So they are developing capabilities. We do know that the next thing that is going to be probably a very regular occurrence in Mexico is FPV drones. We've already seen isolated usage of it, and more than likely, it's going to become much more prevalent. I do want to tell people, though, even though from the military aspect, like you really like cartels aren't highly trained military forces. Like I think I need to break that apart because CJNG specifically loves to release videos of them with these cool military tactical vehicles, and it's like, guys, I've seen your videos that you upload in your social media accounts. Like, no, you guys have you're either drunk, high, and you're just shooting blindly with zero tactics. Like, let's just because actually it's funny when they actually fight the Mexican military, and they're force on force. And I've trained the Mexican military. I was there for a month, and I've trained the Mexican military. Oh, the Mexican military for them. Look, of course they suffer casualties and there's losses and there's a risk and all that. But for the most part, the Mexican military just wipes them out. Like that in that aspect, right? These aren't these highly trained militarized forces that it gets perceived in perception that I think a lot of people might have. But they are trying to advance their capabilities. The issue we're running that I think is kind of different is, yes, cartels are becoming more territorial focused because that's key for their business model. But that's the thing; it's a profit-driven motivation, not unlike ISIS, Al Qaeda, or these other insurgents that has political that generally gives them a higher level of motivation to do something, right? And so that's kind of the difference. And so, but however, having said that, the worst case scenario, obviously, for Mexico would be the situation in Haiti, right? Because that's really the first time. And I talked about this, it's like this is the first time, really, in modern history specifically, that a group with absolutely no political motivation or groups managed to basically cause state decay and failure or state collapse, right? And because if you look at, let's say, the FARC and Colombia now, they have a political motivation, but for all intents and purposes, they're drug trafficking organizations. Like the communism takes a backseat to cocaine and greedy capitalism to make money, right? Same with the Shining Path, same with the ELN. They love to scream Marxism and Leninism, but when the Greens come through because of cocaine, they're the most capitalist you can see. They need those banks to launder the money, right? But at least they have a perception of a political motivation. Mexican cartels, for the most part, don't. You can maybe look at the Knights Templar as being this very weird cultish-like ideology back in the early 2010s, but for the most part, they're profit motive. So I say that because, again, they don't have that political motivation to really alter the situation in Mexico, but we do have the Haiti example that demonstrates unabated criminal groups being able to cause state failure. I don't necessarily believe that that is necessarily the risk for Mexico. One, because Haiti, there was a conglomerations of crises from the earthquake, decades of political corruption, political crisis problems that gangs were able to leverage and exploit for their own purposes, now kind of symbolized by the very famous guy called Barbecue, right? Very, very, very astute in having able to manipulate the situation. In Mexico, generally, we don't necessarily see that, and especially at the federal government, because when cartels release video statements or narco messages, 99% of them are locally focused, and the few that are addressed to the president, this time Claudia Sheinbaum, the irony of the situation is they don't say, we've never seen a cartel member say, we're going to overthrow you or execute the president, because they know it'd be suicide. Because again, Mexico has greater infrastructure, it's a larger economy, much more people than Haiti. And cartels need these governments to be able to do basic services and functionalities. And they actually need a lot of times a judiciary to kind of get away. And they need those banks and businesses. And so I think the concern that I have is kind of looking forward is basically violence increasing to the level of either inside of Mexico the I think the concern is that you start running into a situation of state localized failures more so than what we have now. And then the problem then is, does that invite authoritarianism to take a hold to kind of maintain stability inside of Mexico? Because Mexico, for before the 2000s, was basically run by one political party that nominally had democracy, and in reality it was it was a political party authoritarianism, right? Do you start seeing that that's kind of changing? And again, the problem that Mexico has is, for example, a lot of people criticize Claudia Sheinbaum, rightfully so, for example, for undermining the independence of the judiciary, and I'm all for that criticism. But however, nobody can really say that the Mexican judiciary was anything but a failure already.
Mm.
It's an
Yep.
abstract failure, absolute failure. They provide absolutely nothing of value to Mexicans. So again, that's kind of that narrative is that happens of this kind of this erosion of democratic rule or erosion of others, increased levels of state failures, increased levels of homicides. And obviously, again, the worst case scenario would be Haiti, but I don't necessarily think Mexico is ever going to get there just because of its size and economic and even military strength.
So it seems to me that if there is a plan here, and again, it's debatable what sort of plan the cartels would actually have, it's about exploiting poorly governed spaces to their advantage. Haiti being a key example of this, yeah?
So in Mexican cartels, they do have much more. So the last estimate we got, this was years ago, I think it was the Washington Post reported this, that the U.S. Military assessed that a third of Mexico was under direct cartel control, generally in these more remote areas. And that's generally when we see they actually have like more overt control. Once you get more to the urban, civilian side, where there's more higher levels of civilian population, um, that's where it's more like a bilateral existence between the state institutions and the cartels. And then the question also becomes, is in this city or town, is it one cartel? Is it two? Is it three? What different gangs and local? And then that's when you generally see the levels of violence. But yes, yeah, generally the remote areas is when you see high level predominance of cartel activity.
Mm. Okay, final question, and that is on the war on drugs generally. I mean, critics have said that it's failed. And then of course, we've spoken about the wall before. So if a kinetic response to cartels doesn't work, if the Mexican government sort of plays piggy in the middle among all these cartels, um, and the wall, well, the wall can be circumvented. What's the answer? Is there an answer to these cartels and their violence and the
I mean, so
spillover effect?
yeah, I understand that argument, and but here's the problem. people will look at the homicide rate, specifically when Calderon declared the war on drugs. And again, I hate the term war on drugs because cartels push avocados into the United States.
Yeah.
They push avocados, lime, timber, water. I think there was even reports of jellyfish somehow. Like, I don't know the business model of that, but they do. Anywhere they can use cars, they push anything and everything they can get their hands on, legitimate or illegitimate. So it's not a war on drugs. I think people need to kind of completely remove that vernacular from when we're talking about Mexican cartels because they push everything, or humans, human smuggling. I understand if you look at a graph when the Mexican military declared, Calderon declared war on the cartels and deployed the military, that violence went up. Okay. Here's the problem. Mexico has no other tools. What else are they going to do? Because the cartels continue to erode state institutions and state control and government. And oh, by the way, breaking news, the cartels don't care what you think. They're militarizing themselves. Yeah, they're not an effective fighting force like ISIS, Al Qaeda, even loosely with that, right? I criticize them, and I'm the first one to say, look, these guys aren't, anything like when people ask me, oh, Mexican cartels, anybody who ever says the Mexican cartels can take American special forces on are out of their mind. Like, no, they can't. Of course not. But cartels are militarizing. They are militarizing. So if you're counter to, oh, well, the war on drugs or the war on cartels or the militarization is a failure, okay, great. Two things. One, what other tools does Mexico have? Because they have none, and their judiciary is completely corrupt. AMLO tried to do hugs and not bullets in the first half of his administration. And then towards the end of his administration, he probably became the most militarized Mexican president in modern history. Because even he realized the problem sets of not utilizing the military when confronting with Mexican cartels. So what other tools do you have? And then two, how do you address the fact that cartels are militarizing themselves? How do you address that? And so, yeah, yes. There's a multitude of problems. And oh, by the way, the most effective anti-corruption body in Mexico is the Southern District of New York. The prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, who are the only ones who indict Mexican corrupt officials and send them over to the United States and put them in jail, or actually hold actual cartel members and leadership accountable for their actions. There's a reason why Mexican cartel leaders fight do everything humanely possible in Mexican judiciary to ensure they don't get extradited to the United States. Because they know that the moment that they're in a U.S. federal prison, they might as well be dead. At least in a Mexican prison, they might have some level of control of influence still. But once they get to the U.S., they're done. Might as well just be dead. And so again, I hear that, and it's something that I just say to people is, what would your solution be? Because you can't focus on anti-corruption until there's security. You can't do anything else in Mexico related to economic development because the cartels will just come in and take it from you. I've talked to businessmen in Mexico, and their drivers and everything they do, everywhere they go, they get extorted. So what else are you supposed? And then that's the thing. Calderon, you can criticize the militarization of the war on cartels, but the reason why he did is because he couldn't trust the law enforcement. And guess what? AMLO did the same thing. There's a reason why Mexican customs is now run by the military. It's because customs was so corrupted. The answer to your question, John, is there is never going to be the political appetite, either in the United States or Mexico, to completely address this issue. And it's going to be a very long problem.
Yep.
The best case scenario to happen is maybe Colombia, where they're so active, they're so prevalent, they're still present, but a much more reduced focus. That's the best case scenario, with the government highly corruptible, which is Mexico. Because there's not going to be a serious attempt to hold Mexican government officials accountable. That's the best thing. Because to actually address the problem, it's never going to happen. And so that's what I would tell people. And if, by the way, in a scenario where maybe Mexican cartels get weakened, just as the Mexican cartels supplanted and became more predominant than the Colombian cartels, right? It was the Colombian cartels, then it was the Mexicans because the Colombians lost strength. If the Mexican cartels lose that power and influence, and they'll still be active, don't get me wrong, but if they lose that international active, reach and power, the one I would be looking at to supplant them would be the Brazilian gangs. Because Brazilian gangs are exploding in power and influence in West Africa, South America, and Europe. And the difference, so they're called gangs, but really they're transnational criminal organizations because people like to talk about Tren de Aragua and MS-13, which are problems, but they still kind of operate within that gang infrastructure, just international reach, right? They're the ones that kind of go into the streets, from the street and all that. The actual infrastructure to be a cartel with international reach is not necessarily Tren de Aragua or MS-13, because those are all very loosely affiliated and they operate in their own areas and they just nominally call themselves that. And yes, some of them might have reach to back to their home bases, etc., but they're not the actual, major pushers, for example, of drugs and all that. The ones that are showing that type of level of capability and demonstrating it are the Brazilian gangs. And so if you run into a situation where, like, for example, Red Commando, TCP, PCC also, those are the ones I'm looking at, that's going to happen. And for people to say, well, maybe we should legalize drugs, I just counter with legalize it. Still, these groups are going to exist because when states legalized a lot of marijuana, what we saw was, yes, through the border, the US-Mexico border, there was less trafficked. But a lot of the illegal marijuana farms just moved north into the United States, specifically in California. And the Chinese triads, ironically, have a huge prevalence inside the illegal farming, marijuana farming in the United States. So they just moved it north. And the Mexican cartels they fight for avocados. Avocados are legal, and they fight for it all the time. And so many people in Michoacan die specifically because of the avocado trade. So whatever. Again, anybody who comes here, John, long-winded choice, if we do this, or AB, no, it's not. And I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but that's just the reality. And maybe it's 5 years covering this, that it just kind of boils into that frustration that I just had to say it so bluntly.
Stefano, thank you very much for your dose of reality. And thank you for joining us and sharing your insights on the focus. Oh my God, I don't know. This is going to. I think I've just developed a migraine, and I need to take some hard drugs myself.
Very sorry. I apologize. I apologize to really for that. But I love this. I really appreciate the in-depth questionings. A lot of even for me to have to kind of go in and talk and think about it. But this was great, John. I'm very happy you guys reached out. I know, there's a lot of things that we could discuss, but if you ever want to discuss more in detail about Mexican cartels, I'm always free. But this was a phenomenal conversation, and I really hope your listeners enjoy it because I loved it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stefano. When we talk about Mexican cartels, it's tempting to see them as just another crime story, violent men chasing profit. But the reality is more unsettling. These groups are reshaping borders, bending politics, and penetrating global markets in ways that blur the line between crime, insurgency, and governance. If we continue to treat them as mere gangsters, we may be underestimating their true influence. The question isn't just how Mexico or the United States deals with them, it's whether the world is prepared to recognize that the cartels of today look less like criminals and more like emerging powers operating in the shadows. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Stefano Ritondale. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Stefano and connect with him on social media. Now on to questions for the audience. Do you see Mexican cartels as criminal gangs or something closer to insurgent powers? Should governments negotiate, fight, or rethink their entire approach to dealing with cartels? If cartels control parts of Mexico's economy and politics, where do we draw the line between state and shadow state? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Auscast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor, and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage, and on Blue Sky at thefocuspodadl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.